That night, rain drizzled steadily on the moss-covered wooden roof of a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Cologne, Germany. It was a bitterly cold October evening. Wind slipped through the cracks in the walls and snuffed out the weak oil lamps one by one. Edelina stood silently in the only room that could be called a wedding chamber. She was 16, the daughter of a blacksmith, and had just been given away in exchange for a sturdy ox cart and 2 sacks of springseed. Her husband Gerwald was a 36-year-old widowed hunter with a thick beard, large hands, and a reputation for being mean-spirited when drunk. No one asked Edelina if she agreed. No one thought they needed to. In the eyes of the community, she was a legitimate transaction. The 16-year-old girl now belonged to that man, just like the cart, the seed sacks, and the dog guarding the shed. Outside, Gerwald's friends were gathered in the yard drinking cloudy beer from wooden barrels and stomping their boots in the mud to hasten the process. Their laughter echoed through the dark, interspersed with crude jokes and bets about whether the bride would bleed enough. No one would leave until they heard the confirmation. The creaking of the bed, the muffled cries of the girl, the sound of flesh meeting flesh, proof that the exchange had been completed, honor upheld, and God made witness. Edelina had never been told what would happen. Her mother gave her a few scraps of advice, half warning, half resignation, that she should close her eyes, that she shouldn't speak unless absolutely necessary, that she must accept it because this is what women do to survive. No one spoke of love. No one mentioned consent. Only endurance wrapped in fear passed down like an unwanted inheritance. But the story doesn't end there, because in Edelina's world, the bed didn't belong to just her and her husband. It belonged to the church. It belonged to the village. It belonged to rules written by men who had never touched a woman's skin, but believed they could govern both her moans and her silence. It was believed that if a husband desired his wife too much, or if the bride seemed to enjoy it, they both might have sinned. Sex was not allowed to be joyful. It was only allowed to happen on the right day, at the right hour, in the right position, under the imagined gaze of a saint hovering above the bed. One wrong breath, and you could be damned to hell. So Edelina lay down, not out of desire, but out of duty. She closed her eyes, not from shyness, but from fear. On that straw-filled bed, thick with the smell of firewood smoke and unwashed skin, she wasn't just facing Gerwald. She was facing a system, one where women had no names, only labels, where honor was measured by a hymen, where the screams of a wedding night were a legal affirmation, where a drop of blood could save your life or take it away. Edelina's story is not an exception. It is the rule, the standard, a repeated scene across medieval Europe, from the coldest castle halls to the humblest thatched huts, and behind every closed door that history still whispers. This is not a love story, it is a verdict. Not against the bride, but against a civilization that once believed desire was a sin, and women were the sacrifices needed to cleanse it. This is where we begin, on a damp bed in the German countryside, with the wind howling outside the door, and a breath held tight inside a body that never had the right to choose. Welcome to history, and welcome to the truth, where the bed is not a place of rest, but a courtroom where the world puts love on trial. Edelina didn't know that even the breath she took on her wedding night had already broken at least 3 commandments. Wednesday a weekday, not a proper time for intimacy. It was a day for penance, not for union. She and Gerwald had married on a Tuesday, but it wasn't until late Wednesday night, after the last of the guests had left, that the first night finally began. Wrong day, wrong rules, wrong theology. Because in the world Edelina lived in, sex wasn't simply a private matter between 2 people. It was a theological discipline, detailed, rigorous, written down, enforced and condemned by men who had never touched flesh, but believed they understood the soul better than anyone. A man named Jerome, a 4th century monk, once wrote that a husband who loved his wife too much was guilty of adultery in his heart. He had never married, never had a wife or children, and spent most of his life behind monastery walls, surrounded by books and bricks. Yet he was convinced that carnal pleasure, even within marriage, was inherently sinful. The more you loved your wife, the closer you were, the more you desired her, the more sinful you were. Strangely enough, both Protestants and Catholics, usually so different, bowed their heads to this doctrine, because people feared the body, and anything that reminded them of it was treated with suspicion. Thomas Aquinas, one of the great minds of the medieval Catholic Church, didn't just agree with Jerome, he went further. In his Summa Theologica, which basically served as the Church's user manual for the human body, he laid out detailed rules for sexual conduct. No sex on Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, or Saturdays. None during Advent, Lent, major saint feast days, or during menstruation. None while the wife was pregnant, nursing, or had recently given birth. None just after confession or right before taking communion. And most importantly, no sex out of desire, only for procreation, only to continue the lineage, not because you wanted to. Of course, breaking these rules wouldn't get you whipped on the spot, but you could go to hell forever. And as for positions, only one was allowed, what we now call missionary. Man on top, woman below, face to face, hands in the proper places, no turning around, no standing, no woman taking the lead. Every other position was deemed unnatural, a violation of the divine order, which dictated that men rule and women endure. Did Gerwald know all this, maybe? Maybe not, but it didn't really matter. Because if he broke the rules, the punishment wouldn't fall on him, it would fall on his wife. Edalina was the one expected to track the dates, to know the holy calendar, to remind and restrain. If she failed to refuse at the right time, she was guilty. But if she refused at the wrong time on a permissible day, she was also guilty. A perfect paradox. The woman is always wrong. The only question is how. And that was perhaps the quietest, cruelest truth about a medieval woman's sex life. There was no way to get it right. If she let her husband touch her on a forbidden day, she sinned. If she resisted, she sinned. If she felt pleasure, she sinned. If she felt nothing, she might still be condemned as a cold wife, as a woman who poisoned her husband with indifference, as one who weakened her man in both body and spirit. No one said this out loud, but everyone knew. It was passed from woman to woman in whispers, by the well, in murmurs by the fire, in silent glances, when a young girl was about to be wed. Edalina once heard her mother speak of a woman from the next village. Her name was Lisa, who had her ribs broken by her husband for saying no on a Saturday night. She thought Saturday was a forbidden day, but it wasn't, not that week. A minor feast had shifted the calendar. One day wrong, a lifetime punished. And the worst part, no one took Lisa's side. The priest shook his head and said she should have known the calendar better. The neighbors said her husband was only a man. People clicked their tongues. If she didn't want to, then who's going to bear his children, as if her womb were public property available for use whenever society deemed it necessary? What about the men? Were they bound by these laws? In theory, yes. On paper, yes. In practice, no. No one monitored them. No one instructed them. No one asked them to confess specifics, because the church's concern was the wife. Her soul was the weak point, the doorway for sin. She was where desire began. She was the door the devil knocked on. Which is why if Gerwald loved Edalina too much, that was a problem. If he sought pleasure in her body, if he kissed, caressed, desired, he was no longer a righteous husband. He was committing adultery with his wife. A different kind of adultery, one that didn't require a third person, only genuine affection. Edalina didn't know what to hope for. If her husband was cold, distant, treated her like a childbearing machine, perhaps the pain would be less. But if he was too gentle, too passionate, too intense, she would have to wonder, were they sinning? Was that embrace, that shiver, that breathless gasp, the sign of damnation? In a world where every kiss required theological interpretation, love was more suspect than sin, and sex was more terrifying than death, because death ended things. But sex done wrong meant eternal hell. The church of that time didn't hide its intentions. It didn't just want control over your soul. It wanted control over what happened when the lights were out, The doors were shut, and two bodies lay beside each other thinking they were unseen. It wanted to be present in every moan, every drop of sweat, every hurried breath, because in their view, nothing was private, and anything could be a sin. Sex, what should have been a space for closeness, comfort, wordless understanding, became a maze of guilt, where every turn led to penance. And Edelina, on her first night as a wife, wasn't just learning to be a woman, she was learning to be a soul suspended between heaven and hell, not because she killed, stole, or lied, but because she didn't know whether to open her legs on Thursday or Saturday. Perhaps the cruelest part of all was this: no one really knew the rules. The priest in this village said one thing, the deacon in another said something else, and the woman, the one not taught, not trusted, not heard, was the one held responsible for keeping the law. Every night was a gamble, and her body was the wager. The medieval world wasn't short on texts teaching women how to live righteously, but almost none taught them how to love, because love was dangerous. Love could tip the balance of power. Love could lead to demands. Love could make someone believe their body was their own, and that was unacceptable. In the church's order, women weren't allowed to own desire, only silence. Edelina didn't know all of this in words, but she felt every line of it in her skin. In the way Gervold looked at her, not with disdain, not even with affection, but as if she were a moral equation, a test of virtue, a tightrope walk between sin and duty. She closed her eyes, prayed, unsure what for. She no longer believed angels would protect her, but she still hoped that somewhere in the tangled mess of prohibitions, mistakes, deviance, and repentance, there might be a small space left for gentleness, even if it was just one touch that wouldn't send anyone to hell. And if not, she hoped she'd fall asleep before it began. Because in sleep there are no rules, no sin, no one listening, only her and the silence. When Edelina sat in that freezing room that night, waiting for Gerwold to walk in, there was a weight on her heavier than the body of a man pressing down on her. It was the weight of expectation of blood, not the blood of injury, but of honor, virgin blood. A dark red fleeting liquid, fragile and thin, yet it carried the burden of an entire family name. Virginity back then wasn't a moral concept. It was property, a part of the dowry tallied like a healthy cow or a sack of quality grain. Edelina's father, a poor blacksmith, didn't have much to offer in negotiations, but he had the one thing every poor family clung to: an untouched daughter. Untouched, a word that sounded sacred, but was in truth just society's way of verifying whether a woman had been used or not, as if she were a wooden barrel to be tapped and tested for cracks. Gerwold didn't need to love Edelina. He needed someone to bear children, to keep house, to not taint his reputation in the eyes of neighbors or the local priest. He needed someone, and only one, who had never belonged to another. And she, of course, had no right to ask for anything. It didn't matter if she loved the forest, the bamboo hedges, the full moon, or young men. She would go to her husband's house, as countless others had before her, like a parcel passed from hand to hand, priced by the whispers in the marketplace. Which is why the marriage bed, supposedly a private space for two, came with an entire village of silent witnesses. No one needed to see the act itself that would still be considered obscene. But they needed the blood. Without blood, the marriage could be declared invalid. Without blood, the bride could be returned to her parents in disgrace, shamed and spat upon. Without blood, a life could unravel before it even began. So women started finding ways to bleed at any cost. Some scratched the inside of their thighs with fingernails to smear a few drops on the sheets. Some hid a live chicken under the bed, wrung its neck in the dark, and let its blood soak into the linens. Some pricked their fingers with sewing needles, dabbing blood onto the fabric like a desperate signature of honor. Others learned from widowed aunts-women who had nearly died for failing to bleed that it was wise to soak a scrap of red cloth in wine and hide it under the pillow, just in case a quick sleight of hand was needed in the dark. These tricks weren't taught in church, but every girl knew them. Not from books, but from fear. Edelina had once seen a girl cast out of the village. Her name was Bruna. The wedding had taken place in a rainy spring. The next morning, there was no blood on the sheet, no cries heard in the night. Her husband, the son of a miller, stood in the village square, holding up the white cloth like an indictment. Bruna was dragged back to her parents' home in silence. 3 days later, the rumors said she hanged herself in the attic. But no one spoke it aloud. Everyone knew if you said the wrong thing, you might be the next to be questioned. That fear wasn't random. It had been cultivated by a system of medicine, if you could even call it that claimed the hymen was a thick, unbroken seal, like a wax stamp on a jar. If you'd had sex, it would tear. If it didn't tear, you were still a virgin. Simple logic, easy to understand, completely wrong. But the truth didn't matter if the lie served power. No one talked about the fact that some girls are born without hymens, that hymens can stretch, that they can tear from horseback riding, falling off a wagon, or sometimes never tear at all. In that world, it was black and white. Blood means pure. No blood means whore. No grey area. No exceptions. And from that logic, women became the subjects of a silent auction. The one who could prove herself most pure would get the best match. The rest prostitutes, maids, shadows. If lucky, you might marry an old widower. If unlucky, you'd be deemed damaged goods. And no one keeps damaged goods. Virginity, truthfully, never belonged to the woman. It belonged to her father, her husband, her family. No one cared what she thought, what she felt, what she wanted. All that mattered was that she stayed quiet and bled at the right time. That was enough. That was moral. That was righteous. And if she didn't bleed, then she had better learn to fake it. Not to deceive, but to survive. It was that simple. Edelina's mother had once taught her how to tuck a piece of red cloth into her sleeve in case something went wrong. Not because she wanted her daughter to lie, but because she knew that in this game the rules were never made to protect girls. And if the law won't protect you, then sometimes a lie is your only shield. Those lessons were never spoken aloud in public. But every mother whispered them to her daughter on the night before the wedding, just like they passed down soup recipes in the winter, simple, necessary, and flavoured with blood. Some women survived their wedding nights because of tricks like that. Others who tried everything still failed, because sometimes all it took was a displeased husband for every effort to be labelled deceit. Men of that time didn't need proof. They needed words. And their word, truthful or not, always carried more weight than a wife's silence. The wedding bed was no longer the beginning of a life. It was a courtroom, a battlefield, a place to honour or destroy a woman. One bloodstain, be it from a chick in a fingernail, or her own body, was the border between acceptance and exile. One drop of red, just one, was enough to buy her safety. And perhaps the most chilling part of it all was how normal it was. No one saw injustice. No one saw cruelty. They saw law. They saw tradition. And because of that silence, millions of women entered their wedding nights, not with hope, but with strategy. Not with love, but with a survival plan. In that moment, Edelina wasn't thinking of happiness. She was thinking of blood. She didn't know if she would bleed. She had never ridden a horse, never fallen hard, never examined her own body. Everything was uncertain. But she knew one thing: without blood, her life could end that very night, and that more than any prayer was the real definition of medieval sex. Not pleasure, not connection, but transaction. And in that transaction, the woman wasn't just the merchandise, she was the receipt. Edelina didn't understand her own body, neither did her mother, nor her grandmother, her great-grandmother, or the women before them. Not because they were ignorant, but because they were trapped in a world where even the wisest minds believed that the female body was a defective version of the male one. That the thing we now call a vagina was simply a penis turned inside out. You heard that right? This was official doctrine in medieval medical schools, the very institutions that produced doctors and experts. They believed all humans started from a single blueprint, the male. Women, they argued, were just men who hadn't developed fully. as if God fumbled in the process, folding the penis inward, misplacing the testicles inside the abdomen, turning the entire female body into a mistake in need of tolerance. Back then, medicine didn't separate structure from meaning. They didn't just say female genitals resembled inverted male ones. They believed that proved inferiority. If the penis was a weapon, then the vagina was a wound. If men were heat, women were cold. If men were dry, women were moist. Every biological trait was moralized, turned into a blade that cut into the female form. And like every powerful prejudice in history, this theory wasn't just theory, it had consequences. If women were broken versions of men, it made sense to treat them like tools. If the vagina was merely an inward penis, then sexual violence wasn't a violation, it was an activation. And if their bodies were fundamentally malformed, then their strange behavior was only natural. From that logic emerged a far more chilling belief: the womb could wander. Not metaphorically, literally. According to the most accepted theory of the Middle Ages copied from ancient Greek texts, the uterus was a living creature. It had its own will, and it could move freely inside a woman's body. If a woman went too long without sex, her womb grew restless. It would begin to wander, climb up into the chest, causing tightness, press into the throat, making it hard to breathe. Sometimes it would even exit through the vagina like a stray animal, and if it wasn't lured back into place, it could crush the heart and kill its host. This wasn't folklore. It was in medical textbooks, taught at universities, quoted in lectures, and most importantly, believed. The treatments were just as bizarre. To coax the womb back, doctors might apply sweet-smelling herbs near the vagina while placing foul odors at the woman's nose. The idea: the womb loved pleasant scents and hated bad ones, so it would follow its nose back into place like a lost puppy. The woman would lie on her back legs apart, waiting for her uterus to repent and return. If that sounds ridiculous to you, imagine living in a world where every cough, every fatigue, every headache a woman had was blamed on a body part no one had ever seen and no one truly understood. The womb became the root of all female discomfort, turning women into a species considered unstable, prone to madness, and dangerous if they thought too much. From this came a diagnosis: hysteria, named after hystera, the Greek word for womb. A mental illness for women, only with wildly flexible symptoms: laughing too much, crying without reason, prolonged silence, sudden rage, daydreaming desire, frigidity. Anything a man didn't like could be labelled a womb flare-up. And like any illness, it demanded treatment, not with medicine, but with sex. Medieval doctors came to a scientific conclusion: to keep the uterus in place, women needed regular intercourse. Not because they wanted it, but because it was their responsibility. Preventative care, a biological duty. If a husband wasn't available, then the doctor would step in. And if he wasn't enough, well tools could help. An entire branch of medicine existed for one purpose: to sexually treat women in the name of health, without ever asking whether they wanted it. And from this twisted premise came one of the darkest beliefs of the medieval world: women couldn't get pregnant from rape. Sounds insane, but it followed their logic. They believed conception required a woman's pleasure. She had to enjoy it. She had to reach orgasm. She had to release female seed, a supposed fluid necessary for pregnancy. And if she was raped, how could she possibly feel arousal? And if there was no arousal, there could be no pregnancy. So if she did get pregnant, then surely she must have consented, at least a little, at least in her heart. It was a closed loop of cruelty, a linguistic and biological trap designed to shield the powerful. In courtrooms, women were once asked whether they felt pleasure during an assault. If yes, they were accomplices. If no, then how did you get pregnant? Edalina was never dragged into a courtroom. But she knew that if one day her husband snapped, forced himself on her, beat her, and she became pregnant, no one would stand by her. They'd say, well, maybe she liked it. Because people didn't believe a wounded body could carry life. They believed the womb was a creature that knew right from wrong. And if it opened its door, it must have agreed. That idea has lived far longer than people think. It has wormed its way into law, into literature, into medicine for centuries. Even during the Enlightenment and well into the 20th century, politicians, judges, and doctors still repeated that chilling mantra: a woman can't get pregnant if it was real rape. And buried in that sentence are countless uninvestigated crimes, countless guilty men set free, countless victims forced to live in silence, blamed for getting pregnant. Gerwald Edelina's husband knew nothing of Aristotle. He'd never read Plato. But he was raised in a world that told him men were the standard, and women were the flawed copies. He didn't need to understand the womb. He just needed to know that when he wanted access, Edelina had to open up. And if she refused, well, maybe she was sick. The kind of sickness only he could treat. Edelina didn't know why she felt sad after long nights. She just knew that every time she cried in silence, it was called acting up. Every time she didn't want to eat or speak, her mother-in-law would say, probably her time of the month again. Every time she dreamed strange dreams, ones she couldn't speak aloud, she felt guilty. As if her womb truly were running wild and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But the truth is, it never ran wild. The only thing that was insane was the world around her. A world where knowledge was stained by religion, where medicine was written by bias, and where science was used to maintain power, not to seek the truth. And in that world, a woman's body was not sacred. It was a dangerous mystery to be controlled, subdued, pierced, and rewritten. Not by the women themselves, but by those who believed they understood women simply because they had never truly listened to them. There are nights when Edelina wakes up in the middle of a dream, heart racing, cold sweat trailing down her spine. She's not sure what she saw. A shadow, a hand, a whisper in her ear. All she knows is that she can't move. Her body feels pinned down, her chest heavy, as if someone is sitting on it. And in those long, suffocating seconds, she can't scream, can't fight, can't even open her eyes. It's as if her soul has been locked away, leaving her body adrift, somewhere between dream and waking. Today, we call it sleep paralysis, a neurological phenomenon thoroughly explained by science. But in Edelina's time, it had another name: incubus. The incubus was a demon, not a metaphor, not a symbol, a real entity carefully documented in holy texts, medical manuscripts, exorcism handbooks, and the sermons of priests. People believed the incubus was a male demon, one that came at night, sat on women's chests, had sex with them in their sleep, and implanted within them the seed of evil. A child born from such a union would be cursed, and if the mother didn't die in childbirth, she would spend the rest of her life under suspicion, ridicule, or worse, on a pyre. Alongside the incubus was the succubus, the female demon. She came to men's beds, seduced them in dreams, drew out their seed, and vanished. But that wasn't the end. She would then shapeshift, often into an incubus, and use that very seed to impregnate another woman. A kind of dark, demonic artificial insemination, where the child born carried no rightful bloodline, only a corrupted soul. Medieval people didn't just believe in these things. They built entire systems of logic to justify them. Confessions, trials, exorcisms, abandoned children, all revolving around the obsession. What happens at night when no one's watching? Who touches whom? Who is real, who is not? And who deserves to be burned alive? A man wakes up with wet sheets. No one says it's just a normal physiological reaction. They say the succubus visited him. And if it happens often, he's advised to confess. If it happens too often, he might be punished. Because maybe, just maybe, he liked it. A woman dreams of making love to someone who isn't her husband, even if it's just a dream, even if she wasn't in control, even if she wakes up crying. It doesn't matter. That dream is proof that her soul is impure. Maybe she was raped by an incubus, or maybe she's a witch. And in that world, a witch didn't need a broom or a cauldron, just a wet dream. just being a woman, just failing to stay perfectly silent in her sleep. Like all power structures, the church used this fear to strengthen its grip. Priests were trained in exorcisms. They knew how to ask, "Did you see a faceless creature in your dream? Did you feel something sitting on your chest? Did you feel pleasure?" And if the answer was yes, whether it was illness, exhaustion, or subconscious response that was enough to justify a trial, a curse, a death. Some women were forced to drink holy water mixed with salt and lie motionless in a church for 7 days to purify the soul. Others were bound, starved, beaten to expel the demon believed to be hiding in their wombs. And if they survived it all, they were no longer themselves. What's most disturbing is this incubus and succubus weren't just fears of illiterate peasants. They were affirmed by respected scholars. Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian of the Middle Ages, not only accepted their existence, he wrote that they could transfer semen from one person to another, meaning the resulting child didn't carry the original sin of Adam, but the sin of demons, a kind of demonic conception, a sick logic wrapped in piety. Edelina didn't know these theories, but she knew the feeling of waking in terror. She knew something was wrong on those nights when she couldn't breathe. And when she told her mother-in-law, the woman just looked at her, gave a cold smile and said, "Maybe you should pray more." As if weakness was a sin. As if a demon had visited her, it was her fault. In that world, a woman had no control over her own body, awake or asleep, conscious or dreaming. Everything could be scrutinized. And every vulnerable moment when alone, when tired, when fast asleep, could be reinterpreted as guilt. Sleep paralysis, a common natural condition, became proof of moral decay. A strange dream became a confession. A moan in the night became the sound of evil. And men. They were affected too, but not like women. For them, the succubus was a temptation, a challenge, a trial to overcome. But for women, the incubus was evidence, a sentence, a tool for doubt, for control, for punishment. No husband needed, no lover, just a dream, a sigh, a night spent frozen in fear. That was enough to brand you lustful or possessed. The truth is, that world didn't know how to deal with desire, couldn't comprehend the darkness of longing, refused to accept the blur between consciousness and instinct. And so it gave those feelings the most terrifying names it could imagine: female demon, male demon child of hell. Edelina stopped talking about those dreams. She learned to stay quiet. Like so many women before her, she told herself it's just a nightmare, just the wind, just something better left forgotten. But sometimes in the night, when the weight on her chest returned, when the breathing in her ear wasn't hers, when her limbs refused to obey, she wondered, if this is a demon, where does it come from? From outside, or from the very teachings she had been forced to believe all her life? Maybe the most terrifying thing wasn't the succubus or the incubus, but the world that believed in them and used them to punish the most innocent dreams of all. Blood is life. For men, the blood spilled on the battlefield is an honor. For priests, the blood of Christ is salvation. But for women, there's another kind of blood, one that flows every month, and it has long been seen as dirty, dangerous, and worthy of isolation, like a curse or a disease. Edelina never hated her first period because of the pain. She hated it because of the way her mother looked at her, as if she'd just crossed into another world, a world of sin. There were no congratulations, no explanations, just a cloth handed to her, and a cold warning: don't go near the church, don't touch the bread, don't let anyone smell the blood. In the Middle Ages, menstruation wasn't a biological process. It was a curse, a punishment, a divine reminder that women were the fallen ones, the lingering consequence of Eve's original sin, the first woman who bit the forbidden fruit and dragged all humanity into darkness. Menstrual blood, they believed, wasn't normal blood. It was poison. It could kill. Pliny the Elder. A Roman scholar once wrote that a single drop of menstrual blood could make grass wither, crops fail, seeds rot, wine turn sour, knives go dull steel, Rust dogs go mad, and if a woman on her period stared too long at a mirror, it would crack the mercury inside. That belief didn't die with Rome. It was copied, repeated, written into medical texts, preached in churches and treated as fact. Women were warned not to walk through wheat fields, not to go near wells, not to look at pregnant cows for fear their gaze might cause a miscarriage. And so women were exiled from sacred spaces. They weren't allowed in churches while unclean. They couldn't take communion. They couldn't touch holy books. They couldn't prepare offerings. They couldn't handle bread, milk, wine, or salt, anything considered easily contaminated. In many regions, menstruating women were made to live apart in a small room, a shed behind the chicken coop, or a hut beside the barn. No one wanted them near children. No one wanted them in the marital bed. Because even if no one could see it, the mere presence of menstrual blood could render a household unblessed. The cruel irony. The very men who taught that menstrual blood was impure were the ones who decided everything. They never menstruated. They had no wombs, but they wrote the books. They gave the sermons. They defined what was clean and what was filthy. And they declared women needed to be saved from their own bodies. How could they be saved through sex? It sounds absurd. But that was the solution offered by some medieval physicians. They believed that if menstrual blood didn't exit the body properly, it would build up and cause illness, headaches, depression, madness. And to help unblock the flow, another fluid was needed, male semen. Male seed, according to medieval medical theory, was noble, warm, powerful, and full of life. If menstrual blood was cold and toxic, semen was hot and healing. When the two met, one part would be destroyed, the other would become life. A kind of theological chemistry where the male body offered salvation, not just spiritually, but biologically. And so sex during menstruation, strictly forbidden by religious law, was in certain cases recommended as medical therapy. Of course, women had no say. If the husband wanted it and the doctor advised it, she had to agree, not for pleasure, but for health. Edelina was told as much after her period stopped for several months following childbirth. Her mother-in-law warned her womb might be closing. A village seer suggested burning incense under her skirt. The parish priest muttered about sin. And a doctor from the next village, who had once studied a few years at a monastery, told her husband Gerwald to have sex with her more often. It'll help the blood flow, he said, eyes fixed on Edelina's neck, like he was inspecting livestock. She said nothing, because no answer was safe. If she refused, she was defiant. If she agreed, she was lustful. If she cried, she was mentally ill. If she stayed silent, she consented. And if the blood still didn't return, it was her fault. In that world, women didn't own their cycles. Every drop of blood was an accusation. Every cramp was a sign of demonic presence. And every time a uterus failed to perform on schedule, it was seen as a betrayal of God. The truly terrifying part, no one really wanted to heal to. They only wanted to control. No one asked women how they felt. They only wanted to know, are you clean yet? Can you touch the holy bread? Can you bear children? Are you still polluting men's souls? Edelina learned to hide her bleeding days. She didn't speak. She didn't pray. She just sat quietly folding cloths, waiting for the blood to come and go like it had never existed. And every time it arrived on schedule, she breathed a small sigh of relief, not because it meant she was healthy, but because it meant she wouldn't be burned, exiled, or erased from the world. It's strange, isn't it? Something that happens to over half the human population for decades of their lives, turned into a taboo too shameful to mention. And it's tragic that every attempt to explain it, from Pliny to robed physicians, only made it more terrifying, more vile, more dangerous. Because in the eyes of men who feared women, the most terrifying thing wasn't the blood. It was the fact that they couldn't control when it came, couldn't command the uterus, couldn't turn women into perfectly predictable breeding machines. And when they couldn't control it, they did the only thing they knew how. They called it sin. Edelina was never asked if she wanted to be a mother. No one had ever asked her that. No one had ever asked any woman around her. In that place, motherhood wasn't a choice, it was a fate, a sacred role, a duty. The only reason a woman was allowed to exist after puberty. The womb didn't get time off. people didn't talk about birth control, not because it didn't cross their minds, but because it wasn't allowed. The church made it clear any act that interfered with the reproductive purpose of sex was a sin. It didn't matter if it was a pill, a withdrawal, or a backwards prayer. If God gave you a womb, you had to use it. If God gave you an embryo, you had to keep it. No grey area, no exceptions. And so, if you were a woman back then and you didn't want to be pregnant, you had to do something dangerous, desperate, hidden, and very likely fatal. A shepherd girl from the next village once whispered to Edelina about a plant that grew near the forest's edge, pennyroyal. Small, minty, and when brewed into tea, it would make the womb slip. A vague phrase that everyone understood. Not for healing, but to push a tiny life out of the body before it grew into proof, into scandal, into accusation. Pennyroyal worked, but if the dose was wrong, just a pinch too much, the liver would shut down. Blood would pour from the nose. The body would seize in pain and vanish within 2 days in silence. If there was no pennyroyal, there was tansy, a little yellow flower growing along the riverbank. People picked whole bundles, dried them, soaked them in alcohol, then drank it under the new moon. No one knew the exact dose. Each village had its own recipe. Sometimes it just made you dizzy. Sometimes the womb did slip along with the whole body. If there were no herbs, people used other things. Lead powder, mercury ointment, wine laced with arsenic, even crushed bones from dead animals. Anything to stop the bleeding, to slow the growth, to silence the fluttering beneath the skin. Edelina had heard of a widow in the village who'd ended a pregnancy by soaking her feet in boiling water, eating mugwort, and climbing into a recently extinguished hearth, sitting in the warm ashes all night. She lived, but never had children again. Not because of a miracle, but because her insides had broken for good. Those who survived abortions rarely shared details. They just said, God had mercy on me. But everyone knew it wasn't mercy. It was luck and maybe a curse. Because if they were found out, they could be charged with witchcraft, abortion, murder, contraception, betrayal of God's plan, using herbs and some sorcery, surviving, communion with the devil, a closed loop where any effort by a woman to control her body became reason for punishment. And if you had no herbs, no secret midwife, no reckless healer, no one to trust, what would you do? You would turn to superstition. Some believed that if you took 7 steps backward right after sex, you wouldn't get pregnant. They had to be backward. They had to be 7, not 6, not 8. It had to be immediately afterward before dressing again, facing west. If you missed a step, it wouldn't work. A goose girl once tried it, 7 steps in the muddy ground. She fell 4 times, but she stood up and did it again, because it was her last hope, not because she believed, but because she had nothing left to believe in. Others drank wine mixed with crushed dead bees. Some inhaled ashes of a paper bearing the unborn child's name, chanting, "Forgive me" 3 times. Some buried their faces in the earth, wrapped in blankets, fasting for 3 days after intercourse to confuse the spirit of the child. No one knew if any of it worked. But when you were a woman back then, and you carried the risk of being executed just for your body doing what it was biologically made to do, you tried anything. Superstition was no longer naivety. Superstition was desperate medicine. No one called it abortion. No one called it reproductive rights. Everything was hidden in metaphor, cleansing the blood, lightening the womb, fixing the cycle, letting the woman catch the wind. And everything was passed down in whispers between firewood trips, water hauls, and stoking the hearth. No books, no formulas, no certifications, just blood and belief. Edelina never used those methods, but she thought about them. Every time her period was late, every time her back ached, every time she vomited in the morning. She thought about the fence where pennyroyal grew. She thought about the cost. She thought about the sound of crying no one would ever hear. And then she let it pass. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew whether she chose to live or chose not to give birth, either could kill her. And that was the bitterest truth, that world didn't want women to live. It wanted them to give birth. Birth until death. Die while giving birth. Die after giving birth. As long as the womb worked on schedule, everything else, the soul, the will, the feelings, didn't matter. Because in the Middle Ages, women had no right to their bodies, but they still tried. With herbs, with poison, with backward steps, with blood, with hope, and with something even more powerful, organized despair. There are things that seem so small, so private, that no one would notice, no one would monitor, no one would punish. But in the Middle Ages, nothing escaped scrutiny, surveillance, or sin. Not even the position you lay in during sex. For Edelina, this wasn't anything new. She had heard her mother whisper warnings. Lie still, don't move, don't be the one to start. But the reasons were never explained. Every piece of advice was wrapped in a language of shame and fear. It wasn't until she moved into her husband's home that she understood. Not because anyone taught her, because she was scared into knowing. On the stone wall of the village church hung a painting. A horrific scene, a woman hanging upside down legs, spread fire, licking her body. Above her, a line in Latin read, "Evil begins in a woman's back." Every time Edelina went to Mass, her eyes would drift toward that image, as if it whispered to her, "Are you sure you laid the right way last night?" In medieval theology, there was only one acceptable position. Man on top, woman underneath, face to face, no noise, no creativity, no pleasure. The missionary position, not because it was common, but because it was deemed natural. Man was the sky, woman the earth. The sky belongs above, the earth below. To reverse that order, even by turning your body, was to defy God. Every other position, whether for fun, for experimentation, or simply for comfort, was seen as heretical. If you did it from behind, animalistic. If the woman was on top, role reversal. If both lay on their sides, lazy, sinful. If mouths, hands, or anything besides the holy path were involved, it wasn't just physical adultery, it was an offense against the Holy Spirit. Jean Gerson, a renowned French theologian of the 15th century, once wrote that sex outside the order was a form of blasphemy capable of unraveling society. He wasn't joking. And neither was the church. People believed that demons lurked wherever morality slipped, and there was no place more vulnerable than the bed. Sounds from the bedroom, if too frequent, too strange, too spirited, could spark suspicion. If the wife moaned, if the husband cried out, if there was laughter, if the bed thumped too hard. Any of it could be read as a sign of corruption. The soul had left the body. Instinct had taken over. There were no cameras back then, no audio recordings. But there were servants' ears, neighbours' ears, the ears of widows sitting near wells, and most importantly, the ears of the church always listening to what people thought was private. Edelina once heard of a woman in the city accused of riding her husband. No one knew who had seen it, but the rumour spread fast. She was summoned to a tribunal, forced to swear never to initiate intimacy again, ordered to recite the Lord's Prayer 30 times to cleanse the sin of inverting sacred order. And her husband, he was excused, because he had been tempted by femininity. Femininity, the word used to describe everything uncontrollable. That's why the woman on top position was condemned. It wasn't just about swapping places, it was about power. It was the woman taking control, the man being passive, the unraveling of the gender order God supposedly put in place from the beginning. If a woman dared to climb on top, what next? Would she demand to choose her husband, to say no, to refuse children, to think for herself? These possibilities made the old world tremble, and so the church tightened its grip. Medieval confession manuals, the tools priests used to interrogate the faithful, included questions about position. How did you engage in intercourse? Was your face turned toward heaven? Did you let yourself be tempted into unholy acts? A wrong answer, even just in thought, could mean fasting, self-flagellation, or excommunication. Edelina never asked Gerwald about any of this. She didn't dare. but she could feel it every time she moved too much or let out a moan. He would stop, look at her, not angry, not harsh, but afraid, as if she had said something that made both angels and demons hold their breath. In the dark, she wasn't supposed to be a person. She was supposed to be a shadow, a quiet cloth beneath her husband, a patch of earth to be ploughed without protest. And if by chance she felt even a flicker of pleasure, she would pray, not because it was wrong, but because it shouldn't exist. Once she dreamed. In the dream, she held the power. She touched. She led. She laughed. When she woke up, she was crying. She hit her own thigh, an instinctive punishment, because in that dream she wasn't in the right place. That world taught women that sex was for service, not for imagination. That if you were creative, you were in league with the devil. That if you felt pleasure, you were tearing grace apart. That a single wrong movement could make God turn away. And while men were forgiven, guided, re-educated women were condemned. No evidence needed. Just a misaligned position. That idea didn't die with the Middle Ages. It survives in sermons, in judgmental stares, in mocking laughter at those who dare speak of sex with honesty. It lives in women who fear their own desire. In men afraid of being led. In couples who never ask, what do we enjoy? And so the bed, a place where two bodies should find each other, becomes a courtroom where pleasure is tried, creativity punished, and the body nailed to a cold, divine template. Edalina lies there staring up at the wooden beams. She doesn't know who invented the missionary position, but she knows one thing for certain. It wasn't a woman. Edalina heard the sound of hooves thundering through the village on a summer afternoon, dust rising thick over the brown dirt road dotted with sheep droppings. The rider was a young nobleman's son of a Highland lord, draped in a crimson cloak, a silver dagger at his belt, and a riding crop in his hand. 3 days later, they found the village cowherder girl Marga, 14, crouched beside the well. Her clothes were torn to shreds, and her eyes stared blankly into nothing. She said nothing, and no one asked, not because they didn't care, but because they already knew the answer. The story spread quickly. She sat there alone. She didn't fight back. She didn't scream. And then came the familiar line. Maybe she agreed. The noble boy had left the village by then, taking with him his horse and his satisfied laughter. No one called him back. No one questioned him, because in that world, Marga wasn't the victim. The one who had been dishonored was her father. When a woman was raped, the first question wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "Who owns you?" Women by the laws of the Middle Ages were property. Property of the father if unmarried, of the husband if married, of the brother if the father was dead, of the church if she entered a convent. And if a man violated her, he wasn't punished for the harm he caused, but for laying hands on what didn't belong to him. If Marga had been the daughter of a wealthy merchant, if her father had enough coin to buy the law, if she were engaged to someone powerful, the story might have turned out differently. But she was just a cowherder, and the rapist was a lord's son. So the price of silence was nothing. The laws of that time had clear numbers for each offence. Raping a maidservant, a few silver coins. Raping a peasant's daughter, maybe a beating. Raping a knight's daughter. You could lose a hand, but if the rapist was a peasant and the victim was a noblewoman, he might be hanged. Not because the girl suffered, but because her bloodline had been defiled. A name, a legacy, a system of inheritance that must remain pure. In court, what mattered wasn't truth, but value. Edalina once heard of a case in the city. A gentleman raped a cookmaid and was acquitted because she seemed to enjoy it. But an apprentice who raped his master's daughter had his genitals cut off and his body hung at the city gate, not because justice was served, but because honor had been insulted from the top down, and order had to be restored with blood. If a woman was violated but her owner remained silent, the matter ended. But if the owner felt his honor tarnished, even by rumor, she could be sent to a convent, married off quickly, or killed to cleanse the shame. And the tragedy didn't stop there. If the woman was already married and raped, things became complicated, because more often than not, people wouldn't believe her. Or worse, they'd ask, "Where was your husband? Why didn't he protect you?" And if she became pregnant after the assault, well, forget it. What did you feel when you were violated wasn't the question. The question was, how could you get pregnant if you didn't want it? Proof of rape meant silence, no pregnancy, no emotion, no torn clothing. And if a woman failed to meet all those standards, she had to prove she did not consent. In a world that didn't even believe in the concept of consent, and so inevitably, sexual laws weren't designed to protect the weak, but to punish those who dared disrupt power. Adultery followed the same logic. Edelina knew that well. She had seen a woman in her village, Matilda, beaten black and blue after being spotted walking in the woods with a man who wasn't her husband. No one saw what they were doing, but gossip was enough. Her husband, a cartwright, didn't need proof. He dragged her to the village square, stripped her shirt, and whipped her back in front of everyone. No one stepped in. No one cried. No one flinched. They just shook their heads. She cheated. Serves her right. Ironically, later that same week, the same husband was caught sleeping with the housemaid in the barn. And no one said a word. "He's a man," someone muttered, but a woman should know better. Because in that world, only women were punished for adultery. Men, if they strayed, were victims of temptation. Women, if they strayed, were rotten to the core. If a man cheated, the world chuckled. If a woman cheated, the world burned her. A husband had the legal right in many places to kill his wife if he caught her in bed with another man. No trial, no prosecution. It was called a crime of honor. Because a man's purity wasn't measured by his soul, but by his wife's womb. Edelina had once wondered if she ever fell in love with someone who made her heart tremble, someone who wasn't Gerwald. Would she ever dare to say it? And she knew the answer. No, never. Impossible. Because even the thought of it was betrayal. Not a betrayal of love, but of the place society had assigned to her from the moment of her first bleeding. A woman's body in those times wasn't a vessel for the soul. It was land. Marked, guarded, owned, traded, punished. And every touch, every pleasure, every drop of blood, every silence could be used as evidence against the very person who bore it. There was one day each year when Edelina was allowed to leave the house without asking her husband's permission. Not to go to the market, to church, or to visit the sick, but to go flower picking. They called it May Day, the 1st of May, when spring brushes against summer, the grass is tender, and the flowers bloom in such abundance that no one bothers to count. But no one really cared about the flowers. In her village, as in hundreds of others across Europe, flower picking meant heading into the forest at dusk in small mixed groups of boys and girls, no parents, no priests, no chaperones. When night fell, they would scatter giggling, chasing each other, tumbling onto dew-soaked grass, leaving behind the barriers of society, of the church of family. By morning they returned with a few wildflowers in their hair, a few grass stains on their clothes and eyes that avoided the priest's gaze. No one said anything. No one asked. But everyone knew many babies would be born in February. May Day was never officially called a celebration of sex, but everyone understood. It was the one night each year when the body was allowed to temporarily belong to itself, a kind of freedom that was never recognized but quietly endured. Amidst all the prohibitions, the judgments, the laws and confessions, there was that one night reserved for instinct. No lamps, no books, no God. Just bodies never properly named groping toward one another in the dark. Of course the church knew. They knew exactly what May Day was. They called it a pagan festival, a remnant of heresy, a night of debauchery of witches of the devil. But they couldn't ban it. Because if they did, there would be rebellion. And more than that, because even the guardians of doctrine sometimes wandered into the woods pinned flowers to their robes, and returned at dawn to preach purity with lips still tasting of cider and skin. Edelina didn't go often, but the time she did, she never forgot. Not because someone touched her, but because for the first time she could look a man in the eye without lowering hers. She could laugh when the blacksmith's apprentice tripped over a root. She could say something crude and not get slapped. And when she came back before the sun had fully risen with tangled hair and red eyes, something inside her felt released. Not quite freedom, but resistance. And that resistance didn't stay in the forest. It bled into the taverns, slipped into stories echoed in laughter, lived on in folktales, tales with no known author, never inked on parchment, never taught in Latin schools. But they lived, they spread, they bloomed on winter nights beside the hearth among peasants who didn't read scripture but still knew how to laugh in God's face. Fabulous, filthy, funny, orally passed down stories were among the most enduring forms of rebellion. They told of wives sleeping with priests, husbands being cuckolded, parish priests tricked into blessing a bare ass, thinking it was a mouth. Crude, yes, but buried in them was a sharp wit, a biting satire, only the oppressed dared to invent. No one wrote Fabio down, at least not while alive, but some were eventually transcribed when curious scribes or moved monks couldn't ignore their staying power. In them, the church's rigid rules were torn apart by clever bedroom antics. Faith was twisted to expose the mask of hypocrisy. And women, for the first time, weren't sacrifices but the ones holding the reins. Edelina once heard a weaver tell a story at the tavern. It was about a woman pretending to be possessed so she could mount the priest every night. Everyone howled with laughter. But in their eyes, there was something deeper than amusement. There was satisfaction, relief, a silent affirmation. We still have a piece of ourselves, if only in stories. In a world controlled down to the breath, where sexual positions were monitored, where women couldn't say no, where dreams were considered evidence of sin, filthy jokes, wet dreams, and a night of flower picking became acts of rebellion, not to destroy, but to survive. Sex, once weaponized as punishment, was reclaimed as a weapon of the people. Small, crude, but theirs, not the church's, not the husband's, not the law's, theirs, for one night, one story, one moan in the dark unheard. And so in the thickets of law and chains, there were tiny cracks, places where people could slip through, laugh, touch, dream, and remember what it felt like to be human, not just a tool. Edelina kept those nights in her heart, like a pressed flower, hidden in her prayer book. No one ever saw it, but it was there. And as long as it stayed, she hadn't been completely conquered. There is an object that often appears in modern imaginations of the Middle Ages. The chastity belt, a cold iron ring locked tightly around a woman's waist, covering the area between her thighs with tiny holes for urine to escape, but not wide enough for anything else to pass through. A miniature prison for the body, a womb locked away like treasure, with only one key in existence. Edelina had once heard of it in a story, whether true or not she couldn't tell. A lord setting off on a crusade left his wife behind. Before his departure, he hired a blacksmith to craft an iron ring with a lock fastened to a leather belt. He locked it onto his wife, handed the key to the priest, and rode off toward the Holy Land. 3 years later, he returned to find her dead. Not from infidelity, but from infection, rot, and necrosis, because the belt had never been removed. Debates still rage: did the chastity belt ever truly exist? Most modern historians believe that the majority of artifacts displayed in museums are fakes forged during the Renaissance as cautionary tales or decorative oddities. But even if it never physically existed, the idea of it certainly did. The chastity belt, like so many symbols of control, didn't have to be real so long as it was feared. And that fear was no metaphor. It bled into real life through punishments, through whippings, through sentences handed down to those who defied sexual order. Because if sex is a right, it can be revoked. If sex is a tool, it can be misused, and misuse must be punished. Gerwald once told Edelina about an execution he'd witnessed in a city where he worked as a young man. A man caught in a barn with another man's wife was dragged to the town square, had his pants torn off and was castrated alive. They sat him on a stone bench, tied his legs, and sliced off his genitals. Blood sprayed. The crowd screamed not in horror, but in excitement. A child caught the blood in a cloth to keep as a talisman against evil. Then they hung the man on a post, letting his corpse swell in the sun swarmed by flies. Not because he raped anyone, but because he slept in the wrong bed. In the dungeons where there was no law, no light, and no hope, sexual behavior deemed perverse was often punished more harshly than murder. If two men were caught having sex, they might be stripped naked, flogged with iron whips, locked in a cage together, and left to starve. If a woman was accused of debauched behavior, even with no witnesses, she might be locked away alone, denied food, given only water, until her shameful body finally collapsed from disgrace. Scenes like that weren't rare. Clergymen recorded them in journals. Jailers retold them to new recruits. These punishments weren't just punitive, they were warnings, marking the boundaries. And crossing them didn't just mean losing your reputation, it meant losing your right to be seen as human. The body, once the only possession a poor person truly had, became a stage. A cut in the right place, a blade at the right time could turn a person into a symbol of failure, of depravity, of obscenity. And then they'd be tossed to the margins of society like garbage, like broken things, like spoiled meat. Edelina had never witnessed a castration, but she once heard the piercing screams from a trial in the next village. A girl accused of betraying her husband with hand and mouth was whipped with an iron-studded belt. She didn't die immediately, but no one ever saw her leave the house again. And in all of these punishments, there was no justice, no consistency. Sometimes it was because you were a poor woman, sometimes because you were hated, sometimes because you didn't apologize the right way. The cost of desire wasn't in the act, it was in who you were. If you were a man with power, you might escape. If you were a woman, regardless of guilt or innocence, you were the easiest target, because your body was always seen as the root of corruption. And every rule, every law, every instrument of control was aimed directly at that body. When they created the chastity belt, real or not, they didn't need a steel lock. They needed fear. When they strung up the castrated man in the market, they weren't after justice. They wanted silence from the living. And so in that shadowed world, sex became a personal hell. No longer a place for intimacy, but for torment. No longer a bridge between two people, but a tool to divide, to threaten, to train obedience. Edelina passed through a field just as dusk fell. The wind was cold, the moon a crescent. She touched her belly, where once briefly something had stirred, but never formed. She didn't know sex as anything but fear, but somewhere deep inside, too deep for words, she knew, if one day she could touch someone out of love, out of trust, out of choice, it wouldn't just be joy. It would be reclaiming herself. And there, in the darkness of control, punishment, and chains, perhaps there still remained the faintest glimmer of something else, the power to choose. And now we return to Edelina. She's sitting on the edge of a rough wooden bed beside a cold fireplace, in a room that smells of damp wool ashes and the cured meat hung up that morning. Outside, the rain taps steadily on the mossy roof tiles like the ticking of a quiet verdict. Inside, the candlelight flickers low, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, as if ghosts were laughing. Gerwold enters. No sound, just his shadow stretching across the floor, pressing onto Edelina's bare, freezing feet. He doesn't smile, doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. From the moment she stepped across the threshold of her husband's home, words became unnecessary. This is the hour of duty, not of language. Gerwold's hand reaches out, not gently, not hungrily, just a motion mechanical, detached, like gripping a hoe or tightening a rope. Edelina doesn't pull away, not because she's brave, but because she knows there's nowhere to pull away to in a world that has already carved the mold for her body. On that narrow bed of straw, no flowers, no honeyed wine, no whispers. There is only the smell of damp wood and human skin. But this isn't just a wedding night. It's the convergence of everything a civilization once laid upon a woman's shoulders. Expectations, laws, morals, faith and sin. Edalina's bed is not a place for rest. It is a courtroom, an altar, a battlefield, a place where every rule of piety, obedience and silence is poured out. Here every touch is defined by someone else. Every breath must conform to commandments no one ever wrote for her. Every sound, be it a moan or a gasp, could be used as evidence against her very soul. Because as history has shown us, sex has never been just about two people. Sex is politics. Who gets to initiate? Who has the right to say no? Who is forced to bear children? Who is cast into a role they never asked for? These questions don't live in scripture. They live in a creaking bed frame in the corner of a stone house. Sex is power, not power shared. Power allocated by gender, by class, by silence. And if you have desire, you're already on the fringe. If you act on it, you might end up burned alive. Sex is a tool for punishment, for threats, for measuring purity. And if your body veers off the script just for a night, a position, a passing thought, you could become a demon, a witch, or simply a disgrace. And above all, sex is humanity, the rawest, most vulnerable kind, and the easiest to manipulate, because in that place where two people meet, every force of power wants to wedge itself in, not to love, but to control. Edalina didn't know all this. She didn't have the words. But in the moment Gerwald's hand landed on her shoulder, she knew this wasn't hers. Not the feeling, not the body, not the freedom. This was a duty imposed like harvest time, like sowing, like lighting the fire or spreading the manure. If she didn't moan, she'd be called frigid. If she did, she'd be called filthy. If there was blood, she'd be a good wife. If not, she'd be a fraud. Every outcome already had a script. She was just an actress in a play whose director had died centuries ago, but whose script was still kept sacred by the church, by society, by her father. We don't look back on this to paint horror, nor to glorify endurance. We look back to understand the bed, what should have been the most private of places, was never truly ours. As long as there exists an outside force defining which pleasure is wrong, which position is dirty, who gets to touch, whom sex will remain a tool of power. And as long as that's true, resistance will remain necessary, whether in silence in dreams or in crude laughter by the fire. Welcome to Shadow Historians, where we tell history from the side of the bed, not to help you sleep better, but to help you wake up. Because sometimes to understand a civilization, you don't need to look at the throne. You just need to listen to what happened after the lights went out.